Okay, on to chapter 4 and 5. Chapter 4 is development. I know there's a lot of terms in here that are new to you guys, so um, I would understand the biological stages. We talked about biological and clinical in class. More interested in the biological right now. So know these steps roughly. I'm not going to ask you a specific question, but just understand the differences. Um, Gametogenesis, understand what meiosis is and what the goal of it is, if you will, for either males or females. And then I would understand how we spent a little bit of time talking about as sperm move through the fallopian tube to get to the egg, some steps that they go through to prepare themselves for implantation. Um, so knowing those would be beneficial. Now, again, the earlier slide we talked about the difference between zygote and an embryo, etc. I would understand that the blastocyst is what's going to implant into the uterine wall, and then understand that um, after implantation we form the primary germ layers, the three germ layers, the endoderm, the mesoderm, and the ectoderm, and we'll talk about where those come from here in a second. So implantation, I would be familiar with uh, with certain structures in this image, things like um, the amnion, the amniotic cavity, the embryonic stalk, the allantois, the yolk sac, these lacuna, which are where the mother's blood comes through, um, and then also the chorionic villi, which are what work their way into the uterine wall and exchange oxygen and waste with those lacuna. Finally, I would make sure that you know um, the function of the cytotrophoblast versus the syncytiotrophoblast. We talked about ectopic pregnancies a little bit. Um, they occur a lot. Um, not a lot. They occur enough that when a young woman comes into the ER with abdominal pain, the first thing you think of is an ectopic pregnancy, probably before you think of appendicitis. Just know that the majority are tubal, and they can actually start to develop fairly significantly in these non uterine locations, if you will. Uh, I show you this slide not to not I don't want you to know anything about somites or the pouches, etc. I do want you to be aware that there is a difference between the neural tube, or what will be the neural tube, and the notochord. I would understand what the notochord becomes. I would understand what happens with the neural tube. Um, Neural crest we talked about briefly, but we'll hit that again in a later chapter. So this is essentially the developing germ layers. What happens is the epiblast, you have the epiblast and the hypoblast, and really all the germ layers come from the epiblast. They feed the cells, they give off the cells that are going to become mesoderm, and they also they give off the cells that become the endoderm. So, sorry, I said that wrong. The hypoblast is replaced. It's the epiblast where all these cells come from. So the epiblast gives rise to the three primary germ layers. In an image like this, I won't ask you to identify any image like this, but I would like you to know primitive gut, endoderm, the mesoderm, neural tube. Just kind of being familiar with these structures here will be helpful. And then also the major derivatives of the three germ layers. There's some key things here. Ectoderm becomes epidermis. Your mesoderm becomes not only your dermis but your skeleton, and most of your muscles in your body, the skeletal, cardiac, and smooth muscle. And then endoderm, it's going to be internal epithelium. So reading over this a few times would be good. Coming back to a similar image we looked at, I would understand. Why did I put this on here? And anything you need to know is going to be covered in this image, so let's just skip that one. And then my advisor loves to say that we're all mutants, but there's certain mutants that um, you don't want to be. Um, Aneuploidy is one of those that typically results in a pathologic condition. Um, so understand what aneuploidy is and some examples of aneuploidy. Here they show Turner's and triple X, but there are others that we've talked about in class. And then teratogens, alcohol is the major teratogen today. It's not nicotine. It's not. Um, it's really it's alcohol. And understand, why, what stage it's bad for a mother to be drinking at. What stage of pregnancy, I should say. Okay, chapter 5, the integument. It's kind of a rehash of some of the stuff we talked about in chapter 3. You have thick and thin skin. I would understand the difference and where you have either. This is a fantastic image as a general overview. You have epidermis, dermis, and hypodermis. Um, we will talk about different types of connective tissue in the dermis here in a little bit. Um, I would be familiar with most of it, if not all, labeled items on this image, mostly for within questions. The epidermis, again, it's keratinized, avascular, not a lot of nerve endings. And then there's 5 cell types that we've talked about over and over in the epidermis. Stem cells, keratinocytes, which are really what you think of as skin cells, melanocytes. Then you have tactile cells and dendritic cells. I wouldn't worry about the eponyms so much. I believe, yeah, this next image. I would understand that, the 4 cell types that are on the basement membrane versus the 1 cell type that is not. Again, stratum lucidium is optional. You only see it in thick skin. So the dermis. There are 2 types of connective tissue here in the dermis. Let me back up and let me do it this way. Within the dermis, you have the papillary layer, and then you have the reticular layer. The papillary layer is the projections that come up, and they provide a lot of strength and support to the skin because the skin is actually there's a lot of force applied to it all the time. What I would understand is what type of connective tissue each one is made up of. And then, this is a loose connective tissue. This is a dense connective tissue. Again, so I would know what types of connective tissue for each one of those. These tables in the book are just fantastic. Would be worth reading over these. And then this table right here is a good summary of everything. The hypodermis, we really don't consider it a layer of the skin. Simply, it's there to insulate and store energy, and it provides a connection. Not going to ask you many specifics about hair or nails for that matter. Again, just have a general understanding of some of the structures in here, the gland, the muscle, etc. Same thing. There will be a couple questions about glands and their functions, so I would understand, what the role of each one of these 3 types of glands is. And these are just some examples of those glands that you guys can read. And then this is just to show that the epidermis comes from ectoderm and the dermis comes from mesoderm. Again, good things to know. So I am going to actually keep going to chapter 6, and what I'll do is I'll pause and upload a new video after chapter 7. So chapter 6 is essentially bone tissue, and we've looked at 3 types of skeletal tissue: cartilage, ligaments, and tendons. I would know, the difference between those. The function, one of the, obvious functions, again, electrolyte and acid-base balance is important in detoxification. I would be familiar with general order of things like long bones, articular cartilage versus, well, I should say, there's articular cartilage, and then you have spongy bone, which is surrounded by compact bone. There's a marrow channel in the middle. And then the bone cells, we spent some time on this. The stem cells are the osteogenic cells. Osteoblasts, they build new bone, and osteoclasts, they consume bone. And then osteocytes, those are former retired osteoblasts that are kind of living their life out in they walled themselves in and they're still alive, and they communicate with each other by caniculi, and they live in spaces called lacuna. Again, similar to cartilage, different cell types, different cell names, I should say. And then this is just an overview of those bone cells. Again, I've showed you some images on here a couple times now. I would be familiar with them. Spongy bone, make sure you understand that the middle of the bone is not as hard as the compact bone on the outside. As far as aging goes, I would like you to understand osteopenia and osteoporosis are two different things. Osteoporosis is pathological. Osteopenia is a process. I would be familiar with the difference if I were you. A lot of words here. I think you guys can probably convince yourselves of what's important in there. And these are just some images of osteoporosis. All right, chapter 7 is coming up.